Okay.
So let's start.
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, dear colleagues, welcome to our workshops, Visualizing Memory Conflicts for Reconciliation. So, our workshop consists of 3 parts: theoretical, practical, and after that we have a general discussion. So, let me introduce. I'm Timur Guzairov. I'm a research fellow. I study national narratives, historical narratives, history, politics, and...
Hi, my name is Rickberg. I'm also from the University of Tartu, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Semiotics. And my research is concerned with the question how to teach history in multicultural societies.
My name is Marko Lehti. Come from the University of Tampere on Tampere Peace Research Institute. I'm a peace researcher and kind of my disciplinary background is in history studies. So even if I've been in recent years more concentrating on peace mediation, peace building, conflict resolution, I'm also try to combine with my earlier background with the connective, with the use of history, memory politics, with this conflict resolution context, and that's why I'm gonna be a little bit talk and apply to this context.
And so we start with your talk on the topic struggle over history, resilience as a tolerance towards one's own past. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll treat the theoretical part, but I try to have some kind of a practical or more concrete examples also in the beginning that it not be only theoretical. But let's start with the main points, and where I try to explain it further on why I come on these conclusions. So that the 4 main points are: the right to determine history is usually part of a conflict and is used as a means of justifying specific actions and for repulsing a larger group, but also for creating conception of enemy. That's important. Removing or at least containing antagonistic relationship that is uncaught in historical narratives and myth is a basic precondition for durable peace and for resilient society in general. Third, this would require change how past is remembered and narrated, as well as how the past is present in the practices of today, but it doesn't require uniformity of interpretations. And the fourth, the acknowledgement and acceptance of diversity of interpretation of the past are core building blocks of a resilient society. And even I'm used to think about this kind of talking about the historical narratives in very kind of violent conflict frameworks or in post-conflict framework. I think it matters also when we go a little bit beyond and think about the conflict in a more general term, or also think about the resilient society, what is required for the society to be resilient against any kind of provocation. I think this is make it more important and significant also in the politics, and I know as well in a Nordic context. But if you started with explaining a little bit about what I mean with the historical narratives here. So the first is a kind of simple thing. History as a site of struggle. We're seeing in every possible conflict nowadays that the history is not something left kind of behind. It's really core part of the whole struggle. It depending what really happens, struggle over interpretation. It's a kind of trying to delete, kind of unifying the other parts, kind of narrations and concrete sites, and also kind of disturbing kind of a misinformation, fake narratives, kind of trying to kind of change, provocate, and create a kind of and I think go straight on examples before I go back on these slides to make the kind of concrete examples how the history has been present in several part of the kind of European conflicts from 90s onwards and in really several kind of conflicts. These pictures are taken from the Bosnian War. You still remember that in 90s or have some influences. There's a concrete example there in where you see the bridge of Mostar, that there in that war, they was trying to kind of really, in physical way, kind of destroy the sites of a memory of other kind of conflict parties, also destroy them in a more concrete way. This have become a part of many conflicts. But this is images which is shown an image of a Serb a kind of a soldier in war using the Second World War Chechnik uniform. Is showing how all this is always blurred. Sometimes interpreted that there was a kind of clear continuation of Second World War experiences and that was carried on by the generation. But in practice, it was because there was in Serbia a boom of war movies in 1980s. And most of these paramilitaries who used Chechnik uniforms copied all these uniforms from these movies, not from their grandparents. So the use of history is quite tricky issue. This is kind of couple images for Ukrainian war. You see, this is interesting how quickly you can change the kind of a narratives and how easily you jump some kind of integrating a narrative between what is Ukrainian and Russian into very antagonistic situation, and how you can create this kind of a new images and narratives like a Novorussia, which is now already disappeared. But still, it's become alive, and how you can use it. This is a Louvre National Theatre, which use it in Eastern Ukraine propaganda, show that there's Nazis in Ukraine, even it takes from a movie directed in film, so that's not the real situation. But you can, this kind of all misinformation has become part of how you interpret it. Are you all from Estonians, or are there someone? Those who are from Estonia are quite familiar with these images. And I'm used to kind of study on this Estonian kind of a national, different kind of a memorial sites and their meanings. But this, the upper one is a kind of image of the from occupation museums. And I think it's a quite strong story about when you come in, you have only doors of prisons to showing. This is very kind of a strong narrative to showing up. The Freedom Cross, you all know, if you don't, it's very close to here. And we come to images of the 1970s quite soon. I think this is still, if it's not 1970s, it's talking about 1919 images, but it's one way of simplifying historical complexity of a very violent, very chaotic era. And it's interesting how especially the story which is told behind it, how it reflecting the things that everything is like East-West battle at that time, when everything is in practice was very complex. But more interesting way how the histories become part of this different kind of public expressions and performances, and it's a Bronze Sword case, and we have of course the 10th anniversary of the Bronze Sword incident. No one noticed that in Estonia. I didn't follow that, but or celebrate it or anything that. But it's interesting. Kind of incidents which happened 10 years ago about this Second World War memorial, and how it's kind of a replacement or decided the official generated the kind of a riots in Tallinn. But it's also interesting how with the one quite ugly kind of a memorial was attached so many kind of strong emotional kind of a historical narratives. For one side, it's a representative of pressure from the Estonian national narrative, representing the whole Soviet occupation. From Russian official side, of course, it's connected with a large kind of grand story of a Great Patriotic War, which is the main kind of grounding blocks of the current identity. And for the local, perhaps the Russian minority, it was at the moment strong elements also counter-narrative of the Estonian main nationalizing story. So it's a little bit beyond the official Russian ones. But how all these clashes and became this kind of one-night struggle in that. And here in the end, in the picture which I like more is a Christina Norman's installation of a golden Bronze Sword, which he created, called After War. And she wrote, an artist, explained it, his kind of artist exploration, that it was a participatory experiment and an intervention through which I am trying to create a possibility to make a tolerant approaches to history between official history writings, but not choosing an historical truth from either of confrontational memory collectives. And I think that is what I'm trying to do, explain in more theoretical terms, to explain how it can be approached. So if you go back on this and then they go first, so we can look about this kind of a practical performances and actions of a kind of how history is a kind of a side of a struggle. But then beyond that, it's interesting how the history still created history narratives as a kind of a meta-narrative to give a significance and build up antagonist relationship between the parties, and how they build up this kind of give a roles to be victim and perpetrator, and create a big divides between the groups, and that is a core issue, how to go over on this kind of things. And this is said on a theoretical point of view, it's easy always to write history a new way, because history is so complex. You can find always a new kind of perspectives, and always you look at the history from a current perspective. So when you go 10 years future, we see the history a new way. But when we are in this kind of situation, we have a very kind of a strong historical narratives, kind of a building up antagonism, given roles that we are the victims of the history. Those who are the bad ones, the guilty ones. This kind of stories are very resistant for the change, and that's I'm looking at how we can find out on this situation within next 10-15 minutes. Yeah, I don't think I can manage. So this is been what I've been thinking about quite long in recent years. How you go over on this kind of antagonist situation, which is very much a kind of anchored on historical narratives. How you can open up that and go further on. And I'm quite a lot of starting to define the whole conflict as a kind of a antagonist situation between antagonist identities. And there it is a kind of question of historical enmity, hatred, insecurity, and they all are kind of entangled with this kind of past narratives and create this kind of existential fear of a group survival. Is something kind of the other side is threatening our whole existence. This is very important in post-conflict situation, but we will not stop there. This is people usually don't kind of solve them. They remain in mind of people. Look at the Bosnia. They still believe on the other side of the enemy. They have not been solved on this. But this role of a victim perpetrator is much more broader. I think this is seen also in Estonian history writing when they talk about what happened in the Second World War. Who were the victims and who were the perpetrators? It's quite easy to kind of everyone know. Who knows Estonian classical kind of national history writing can kind of these. But how can transform all this antagonism? And there I'm one standing thinking about what actually we can do. If you look about be interesting about the French philosopher Chantal Mouffe, and in practice she take a couple words back. We cannot go over antagonism. It's quite natural for people to hate each other, so to be so that's this. We cannot escape that. Antagonism cannot be solved, but antagonism we can transform the antagonism to agonism. So we can do something about it. We cannot make them that kind. Those we are seeing as enemies. We start to love them or seeing them as only as a friend immediately, on overnight. But we can aim to change what we see the enemy to be destroyed to adversaries. We don't need to like them, but we don't always think about they are threat for us. We have to destroy them, otherwise we are kind of destroyed. And that requires some kind of aspect of respect. You don't have to accept everything what they are, but some kind of respect and a recognition of the other side. And that's meaning the agonistic approach does not aim to explain a difference away, but see difference as essential for peace. So we have to cope with always with the difference. We cannot explain that away, but have to deal with it. If you look about the kind of then go back on this. Historical narratives and how they kind of preserve the antagonist relationship. There's a kind of a big challenges if you look about the go over on this, and to find out this role, because the challenge is here. They are very much securitized, which I'm using the term. So meaning that it's the community trying to kind of, because seen as an issue of existential threat. And it's not allowed to openly criticize the core issue. It's not kind of too much openly to take another narratives. And it's always kind of explain it that the other side don't understand us. We have to explain it better. They don't we are misunderstood by others. We have to make our kind of interpretation to be understood. And then over on this situation and to kind of allowed a diversity to prevail is a kind of a big issue, because it's seen really as a kind of a threat of the whole community existing. And in many sense, in a very bad conflict situation, this is really important, because if you look about, for example, Palestine-Israel conflict, it's really the conflict which gave the kind of a meanings for their identities. Without the conflict, they lose the core issue, how they define what they are. And in this kind of things, the making peace is suddenly a kind of a threat for the thing. And that's why it's quite difficult to open up these narratives, especially in violent conflict situation, but why not in elsewhere? But I suggested a couple issues where you can take. The kind of a step is always a small one. You cannot change the whole kind of narratives, how the community kind of define their kind of being and where they come from, they're going on in as a totally. You have to start with small issues. But the two things which I'm saying is important. The one thing is change how the past is dominating your present thinking, and the kind of change the horizons of the thinking. Change from horizon of the past to change the horizon of the future. Quite often in kind of post-conflict situation, it is like here the Prager says, traumatic memory follows the present as it were the past. It's the reviving of past experiences rather than remembering of them. So that some traumatic experiences are always kind of influencing how you're seeing the current and the future. So for example, in the Bosnia. So that's still what happens in over 20 years ago is kind of is like a present. It's like they cannot and that kind of things is needed to go over. And one thing is the kind of a focusing practice on the future, because you're starting to think about the future differently, you see the past differently. The future is beginning, it's a kind of words, but I think it's a wise words also to making the change. Not starting to change the past, starting to change the future first. Another thing which I'm saying is quite important from a practical point of view is what I'm saying is not think about only antagonist identities, not see two antagonist kind of fixed groups, but look about the identification, look about how are these antagonist narratives of the past are constructed, who are talking about them, who are presenting them, and because there is never static identities. Identities are always diverse, but in antagonist situations they are not allowed to be diverse. The kind of a certain public pressure that the presenting the groups is quite uniform, as even always they are very diverse, and not kind of a changing of this kind of looking for the identities and identity changes. When looking for the identification processes, you bring the agency back in there. You kind of look about who are the kind of those who are narrating these narratives of hate, who are kind of what are the important performances, practices of presenting the history. What are the symbols, the rituals through which the kind of people are participating on or commemorating certain things, and how the people are become a part of history. And it's much easy to kind of copy the historical and make the change if you started to change on this issue. And I think I'm referring to what are the examples I have earlier. So that's why, for example, in Bronsoido case, this Christina Norman's artist's installation of a cordon Bronsoido is important kind of interventions in that, because it's changing this kind of very antagonist situation and showing that yes, there's other ways to go beyond this situation, and with these kind of small things, entering intervention on these kind of practices of performing history, you can probably surely make a sense, make a change. With that one last slide, I think I was make my time. Is a thing that what would be the goal? What we were looking at? I think when I'm kind of defining the kind of a sustainable peace or resilient society, is a possibility of narrating an alternative and even contradicting interpretation without fear of re-escalating or conflict or violence. Well, this is putting it in violent conflict system, but I think it's the same thing in all society. If you don't fear that even you're challenging some major kind of a national group narratives, it's allowed, it's possible, then there's a kind of we can talk about the really existence of a resilient society. It's a resilient society kind of allows and tolerate a different kind of opinions about its own past. It's needed kind of a platforms of a dialogue. It's creating space for speaking and listening, community considered neither by victim, perpetrator. And that's important, that there have to be some places where you are not these roles to make a kind of a change. But rather those willing to be champion to show themselves that they're part of it. How to do it? I think we have in previous session a good examples of that. You can make this kind of, for example, popular culture, make nice kind of spaces so that you are not either or. You don't think about that. I have an example of read once about Northern Ireland conflict in 1970s, where there was strong roles of the victim of the perpetrator between Catholics and Protestants. But then there were kind of a punk rock clubs where you go there and no one cares that, and that created spaces where you can be beyond that. And I think this is important. What we heard in last session about this, it breaks also historical narratives. And this is also back to the Muffair. Transform the enemy from something that wants to destroy new person whose idea we combat, who's right to defend those ideas we do not put into question. So that we don't need to accept them. We have to just accept that the diversity, and we don't agree with everything. So that is that we don't need to fight over all what we needed. And this is the very last slide. What I think, how it make it the sense also in a Finnish, Estonian, Nordic, whatever context. We think about going a little bit beyond from conflict transformation to resilient society or resilience building, that is needed in any kind of a society. Is very much with dealing with the diversity of groups, coming from have a different background. And here, if resilience is referring to ability of individuals, communities, countries, or regions to anticipate and manage risk, as well as to respond to cope with the recover and transform from shocks. I think this ability to cope with one's own kind of diversity of one's own past is a core issue to have this resilience. And in all situations where you started, always the struggle of the truthness of your own historical interpretation, and this is the one and only right interpretation, you are going on antagonist directions. And then you're playing that game. But it's more or less that you more easily tolerate the kind of a diversity. What are the limits? I don't know. But it can be turned also other way around, so that it's also from security point of view. I think from an Estonian point of view, it's really kind of important. And I think this is already taking place, that the Estonian narratives to national history canon would increase inclusiveness and resilience of political society in general. And that's even we are in a situation perhaps with Russia that it's not so easy to kind of reconcile at the moment. We have to do that. I think this is also important. But it's make it easier also to cope with this kind of bigger challenges if the society is more able to talk, to kind of tolerate the diversity of historical narrations. But we needed a kind of what we needed is a dialogic transformation history, and needed a platform where this kind of a change is making possible. Okay,
So,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you. Does anyone have a short, quick question to Marko? No. But you will have a possibility to pose some questions to him later. So let's go to the second part of our workshop,
Yes.
the practical one. So how many people are there? So
But you want to divide already?
yeah, before. Excuse me, Merit, yes.
I will
this is
make
all-
a small
but-
introduction before, and then we will.
Yeah.
We
I just
can.
forgot.
Yes. Okay. So thank you, Marko. I think it was very. Your presentation will help us also in this practical part that we have come to now, and namely, we will try to discuss how to tackle those issues that were already presented in history education. And the approach we like to offer also deals with this problem of this antagonistic relationship between us and them. And our question is how could history education help us to ease the tensions in society that are caused by conflicting memories or contradicting historical narratives? And what we would like to offer is not to try to find some kind of consensus between us and them, or try to find a narrative that would be suitable for both sides. Actually, quite the contrary. We would like to take a historical conflicting event and break it down into even more sides and actors. And by that, we can, instead of having this picture where there's us versus them, we will have a historical picture with multiple others. So in this approach that we are introducing today is becoming more and more popular in history education. It's called multi-perspectivity or multi-perspective approach. But at the same time, the notion, as it is a popular word nowadays, the notion has also become quite vague, and it's difficult to actually, for teachers, as much as I've worked with history teachers, to understand what is the aim of this. And it is important to understand that it's not only about actually just getting to know different perspectives or presenting information from different perspectives, and so like enriching our picture of the past. Actually, what is much more important is how this approach can help us in changing the way we think about history, and how we learn to notice different perspectives. And what is also very important to point out is that multi-perspectivity does not mean historical relativism. If we talk that history has different perspectives, it doesn't mean that we have to give up the notion of historical facts, or that we shouldn't like strive towards, in at least what we call academic history, towards this more or less objective point of view, or this should still be our goal. What is important with this approach is to learn how to separate those two things. I will bring an example that if we, for example, talk about conquering a city as a historical event, then the story that will be told by the conqueror is very different from the story that will be told by the ones being conquered, right? But it doesn't change the fact that this event as a historical fact still happened. So, and the problem that usually where memory conflicts in society arise is that the perspectives that give us meaning, that give us attitude and emotions towards historical facts, kind of stick to the fact. And we start looking at the historical fact as, or the emotions and meanings that we apply to the historical fact as a part of the fact itself. And we forget that it's actually our perspective that gives the meaning and it's not in the history itself. So in order to start noticing and separating those two things, some sort of a deconstruction process is needed. And that's why we, with Timur, have tried to design an exercise that could be used in history classes that would help us to make this differentiation in a very profound way. So what we have done is we have presented this, so to say, objective history or historical facts in verbal language and separated perspectives from it using visual language or visual form. And through that exercise, we will try to, for the students to go through the process of how perspectives add meaning to the facts, to actually put those two things together and see where the meaning comes into the history text, so to see, or historical narratives. And the task that Timur will soon introduce to you also has another aim, in our eyes at least. And it's this, that to make students to notice how the illustrations that are, for example, used in history textbooks change the meaning of the text we read. Even if the text itself can be very neutral, then depending on how the authors have decided to illustrate it will actually guide our focus and create meanings that are maybe not in the text, but that appear in the relation between the visual and the text itself. And as Marjo Lauristin also yesterday pointed out, that for the younger generation, visual information is not only the illustration, it is the text itself.